My name is Peter. Before I left my home to follow Jesus of Nazareth, I was a partner in a fishing business. We did well, and I made pretty good money. I don't brag about it, but I was the first disciple that Jesus called. And I was the first disciple to be called an apostle. I was the first disciple to confess Jesus as the Messiah and Son of the living God. Now, lest you think I am bragging, I actually learned that following Jesus turned out to be not anything like I had thought it would be. I lost everything except one thing. And that one thing I gained made all of the losses worthwhile. So listen for a moment while I'll explain. We all, that's the 12 of us plus Jesus, and there's some other people following, but we were all going one day to towns around the city of Caesarea Philippi. It's a Gentile city, not a Jewish one. Caesarea Philippi was out of the Jewish homeland. The people of the city and its environs were certainly not hostile to us Jews, but they weren't really our allies either. They knew what we believed and respected it, but that's about it. On the way, Jesus asked us what the people of Caesarea Philippi thought of him. Who did they think he was? Well, we disciples, we always kept our ears to the ground. We were usually surrounded by Jesus groupies, and we had a good idea of what people said about Jesus, even in places that we haven't even visited yet. So we told Jesus that the people of Caesarea Philippi, well, some of them mistakenly thought he was John the Baptist, and the relatively few Jews who lived around there thought that he was Elijah returned in power. At any rate, all of these things were actually compliments to say about Jesus. However, Jesus seemed not really to care what the people of Caesarea Philippi thought about him. His next question got really directly to the point. He asked us, "But what about you? Who do you say that I am?" Now, we clearly understood that Jesus was asking all of us disciples together. Who do you say I am? Jesus asked, meaning, who do you all say that I am? The other disciples kind of turned to me to answer because, as I said, I was the first one whom Jesus called to follow him. The question, though, wasn't really surprising. We disciples had talked about that for quite a long time, and we were prepared to answer. So I told Jesus what we had all agreed. I said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God, the anointed one." Now, I've gotten all the credit for being the first to make this confession, but all the other disciples nodded their heads when I said it. We all thought that. Shortly, though, these words came back to haunt me. Our ultimate destination was Jerusalem. None of us knew it at the time, but it would be Jesus' last visit to the city. We disciples didn't yet understand that Jesus' messiahship would be significantly different from what we expected, completely different, actually. It would be a spiritual messiahship, not a political one. We thought that Jesus was headed for kingly glory as an earthly king of the Jews. As it turned out, Jesus was headed for glory, but not of any kind we would have recognized as such at the time. I have to tell you, Jesus was often a hard person to figure out. He was the wisest individual I've ever met, but a lot of the things he said really didn't make obvious sense. Like other Jewish sages of the day, he told a lot of parables. But the meaning of Jesus' parables were not always clear. More than once we had to ask him to explain them, and he'd tell us if we asked, but he rarely volunteered that information. So by this time on our journey, we were used to a certain element of mystery in what Jesus said. Jesus began to teach us about the things he must undergo, great suffering, for example, and to be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and to be killed. And then after 3 days, to rise again. Now, this was no whispered secret. He said all of this quite openly, apparently not caring whether the people who followed us overheard him. In fact, he had motioned some of them to come closer. Well, I'm going to tell you, that was just too much. I mean, we had heard Jesus say a lot of, strange things. But this business about suffering and death, and what was that all about? And after 3 days, rising again? Well, that seemed, loony, if you'll pardon my frankness. The other disciples all glanced at me. I knew they wanted me to set Jesus back on track. When I was running my fishing business, sometimes I'd make business decisions that were not going to turn out well. And my senior hired hands knew not to put me on the spot in front of the other people there. I mean, you just don't handle the boss in public, right? When the boss goes off on a tangent, you just kind of take him aside and you talk to him privately. And I knew this, and so I tugged at Jesus' elbow and asked him to step over here with me, a little private chat with the boss, and we can get rid of all this suffering and dying stuff. I failed to remember that Jesus never went off on a tangent. Never. I have never known anyone who chose his words even as carefully as Jesus, much less more carefully. Every syllable he spoke was intentional, even when he, spoke quickly. However, I had a well-deserved reputation for quite the opposite. I was going to counsel Jesus, and I forgot to engage my brain before my tongue. And I took Jesus aside and rebuked him. What a poor choice of words. I rebuked Jesus the same way that Jesus had taught us to rebuke demons. Didn't mean to, just came out. And just as soon as I said it, I knew I had blown it big. I'd implied that Jesus was crazy, maybe even demonically possessed. And yet just moments before, what had I said to Jesus? That he was the Christ. Open mouth, insert foot. That's my style. Jesus didn't say anything at first. He just shook his head and turned away. He knew that I shot off at the mouth every so often. And then he saw the other disciples standing there, and the look on their faces showed them that they agreed with me. He knew he had to respond. And boy, did he, right between my eyes. I did not like being called Satan. I mean, Jesus could have physically struck me and had less effect. If I had unintentionally implied that Jesus was under a demon's influence, he very intentionally said outright that Satan himself was in charge of me. The other disciples kind of jerked when they heard Jesus say it. They knew it applied to them as well. Jesus demanded that we evaluate his life and mission from God's perspective, not our own. We had to put God and God's will foremost, not ourselves and what we wanted. Well, Jesus got kind of fired up, and he motioned for all the other people there to come closer. And then he told all of us that to follow him, we would have to deny ourselves and take up a cross to follow him. If we wanted to save our lives, we would first have to lose them. And in losing our lives for the gospel's sake, we would be saved. Like I said, sometimes Jesus was hard to figure out. The whole world, he said, wasn't worth our lives, and even if we owned the whole world, we couldn't use it to buy back our lives. And then he gave us a very harsh warning. If we were ashamed to be known as Jesus' disciples, then he would be ashamed of us when he came again in glory. Now, people muttered a lot when they heard that, but for once, I had the good sense to keep my mouth shut. You know, Jesus knew that he had powerful opposition. We all knew it. What repelled us by Jesus' words was not that he understood that his return to Jesus would be dangerous for him. It was that it would be dangerous for us too. And we didn't like that he was okay with all of that, that Jesus accepted this risk so readily and seemed so little inclined to head it off. We wanted to convince Jesus to spin his preaching a little differently, tone it down some, not anger so many powerful people, do some good PR, and kind of let the power structure of both the Jews and Romans see that he really wasn't a threat to their status and their power and their positions after all. And then we'd have time to establish a popular base for the next step, which as a descendant of David, Jesus could rightly demand that the throne belonged to him. Well, Jesus' little speech that day on the way to Caesarea Philippi, and the crowd that heard it, that made us tear up that plan. Better than we, Jesus knew that his coming suffering and death would not result from just random acts of violence. Pilate killed more than most anyone who opposed his imperial power, but I don't think that Pilate felt very threatened by Jesus until late. Probably just considered him just another religious nut out of the day. There were plenty of them, The Jewish High Council was mostly corrupt. They'd been long ago co-opted by the Romans. But by itself, that doesn't explain why they wanted to hand Jesus over to the Romans. What we disciples had in mind for Jesus was to get him to politicking with the right people so he could become accepted by the establishment in Jerusalem. We thought Jesus should spend a lot of time getting on the good side of Caiaphas, the high priest. We sure didn't suspect that Jesus intended to do the very opposite. Once in Jerusalem, he was going to challenge the establishment more strongly than ever before, to the point where they would just not put up with it anymore. I think that Jesus foresaw his death, but I don't think that he went to Jerusalem specifically to die. Jesus did not seek death as an end in itself. He sought to do the will of God, even if it led to death. Jesus' overwhelming desire was to follow the will of God, his Father in heaven, whether it led to life or to death. As events unfolded, it became apparent to Jesus that obeying God was going to have lethal consequences. Jesus was horrified at the prospect of arrest and execution. I'm telling you, I've been scared, and I've seen scared men. But that night that Jesus was arrested, Jesus was terrified. He prayed in such anguish that his sweat fell to the ground like drops of blood. Even so, he never prayed for rescue. He prayed for God's will to be done. His love and his faith gave him courage to stay the course. Now, Jesus, being Jesus, accepted the necessity of his suffering. And me, being me, did not. Looking back, I now know that my theology was defective on the day that I walked that walk with Jesus. I had an operating theology of happy endings. My dream was that we would march into Jerusalem not long before Passover, palm fronds waving, hosannas being sung, and start in motion a series of events that would put Jesus on David's throne. And I would be Secretary of State with great power and prestige. The people who opposed Jesus throughout his ministry were mostly the powerful and the influential. Not all of the power players of Judea opposed Jesus, but almost everyone who did oppose him was a member of the establishment. And it never occurred to me that opposition to Christ could be found among the non-powerful and the non-influential, because I had neither power nor influence except among the 12. Jesus knew better. I was one of Jesus' inner circle. And yet when Jesus looked on me on that day on the way to Caesarea, he saw a close friend and a disciple, and he saw an opponent. I defend my intentions. My intentions were good. I wanted to preserve Jesus' life. I spoke against violence, not for it. Jesus was my leader, my teacher, my friend. Is it any wonder I wanted to turn his path away from the cross? I knew that I had Jesus' best interest in my heart, but I was not on God's side. Even our own best intentions can be so clouded by fear and doubt and self-interest that we deny the will of God. I confess I wanted my walk with Jesus to be pleasant. And not really meaning to, I wanted to take the scenic route into the kingdom of God. Jesus knew the only route to the kingdom of God for him lay right up to Golgotha. There's no road to Christian salvation that bypasses the cross. Our challenge is to refrain from trying to pull Christ aside from his journey and for us to walk with Christ in self-denying love. Jesus' journey must be our journey. To set us right, Jesus taught us that discipleship means self-denial, taking up a cross, saving your life by losing it. And we came to understand it as a call to share in Jesus' suffering. I thought that suffering was to be avoided, but Jesus challenged us to think godly. Suffering is not an essential component of following Jesus, but it isn't ever to be avoided when the will of God is foremost. The gospel message just doesn't match the larger demands of society. And I found that taking up the cross to follow Jesus meant that I had to divest myself of my worldly interest. I had long ago given up my fishing business, but I came to realize that apart from following the will of God, there is no me that finally matters. I could have spent my life trying to acquire the whole world and still lost me. It would have done me no good to have gained all the world and lost myself. To take up a cross to follow Christ means, at the minimum, to give our time and our money and our talents to Christ every day in the service of Christ and Christ's kingdom, God and our neighbor. Apart from that, if we don't do that, one day you'll discover that in all the you that there is in the world, there is no you that finally matters. Only by letting go of yourself will you be able to take hold of Christ. And when you do, you will know for the first time who you are. That was the one thing I found and gained that made losing everything else I had more than worthwhile. You know, the two most important days in our lives are the day we're born and the day we find out why. Are you clinging to your life, to old habits or routines? Is that why you were born? Do they connect you to what is good and pure and holy and eternal? Let go of yourself. Take hold of Christ, and then you will wonder why no more.